Dr. William Struthers, scene one, take one. Mark? So Bill, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm an associate professor of psychology at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and I teach in two different programs. One is the undergraduate program, the typical bachelor's degree program, where I coordinate the intro psych classes, but I teach courses in behavioral neuroscience and men and addictions and psychopharmacology. And I also teach the graduate students in the doctoral program as well, their courses in psychopharmacology and the biological basis of behavior.
So in general layman's terms, what does that mean?
I'm a brain scientist. What I do is I look at the effects of drugs on the brain, and I look at how the brain sort of responds to the environment.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about your area of expertise?
Sure. When I was an undergraduate, there was a professor who came to my college, and he was doing research on cocaine and rats engaging in sexual behavior, and I thought, I've got to study under this guy. And so I started studying under him and began, even as an undergraduate, to be very interested in reproductive behavior, to looking at mechanisms of arousal and drugs. And then I graduated and went on to graduate school, where I continued to study that as well at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And while I was there, I really kind of came to the conclusion that what I wanted to study was how the brain gets aroused and how the brain is aroused by new things, by novel things. And so most of what I was doing research with rodents, working with rats and slicing up their brains and giving them drugs and putting them in new environments to see how we could map out what's going on in the brain when they take a new drug or when they're put into a series of new environments, what types of genes turn on, which are map indicators of what parts of the brain are active. So as a graduate student, I was very interested in mapping out what goes on in the brain when you take a drug or when you are exposed to sexual cues. Much of my research was on males, looking at how they would respond to females and what parts of their brains lit up.
So you're speaking about chemical stimulants in the same box as sexual stimulation or pornography. Is that in actual fact the case?
Well, they are the case, because there is a single circuit in the brain that is responsible for, roughly speaking, reinforcement. That is, things that feel good. Eating, drinking, and sex are all natural things that feel good. Drugs just seem to short-circuit this circuit, and they jump in immediately because they can be taken as a pill or as a drink, and they activate this very same circuit, which is why drugs of abuse feel good. Well, pornography is inherently something that is a natural reinforcer. That pornography is tapping into what's already there. With a drug, you're taking it in and it's short-circuiting the system. Pornography is just normal sexual stimuli that we're sort of already pre-wired to be looking for. It's just that the difference is that it's artificially produced, whereas in the case with a husband and a wife, for example, the wife is actually there. So it's a real-world type of stimuli. Well, I think a better way of using the drug analogy is to kind of actually move away from it, because drugs are taken into the body, and many people will criticize people in this field and say, well, pornography is not something that you consume into your body and gets distributed by the blood to the different parts of your body. So it can't be a drug. It can't be something that you have an addiction towards. But I do think that what pornography is doing is it's taking advantage of that same system and just inducing it in a way that is deceiving the brain. The brain is really thinking that these women are in fact in front of you when they're really not. They're just pixels on a screen. But your eye picks them up as if they're the same thing. And so what it does is it goes in and it hijacks this system and fools it into thinking that something's really there when it really isn't. Mm-hmm. And that's the beautiful thing about media, is that you can do that. But that's unfortunately what happens with pornography.
In your book, Wired for Intimacy, the subscript is How Pornography Hijacks the Male Brain. You used the word hijack. Why did you use that word?
Well, because the whole point of using the hijack terminology is that it's taking it to a different location. It's taking it, and the plane is supposed to go to a certain spot, right? Or the car's supposed to go to a certain spot. And when it's hijacked, it's taken to a different place. And so I think what pornography does is when the brain sees sexual cues, it wants to go to a specific place. And so pornography takes that tendency and it turns it to a different place. It initiates sexual arousal without any hope of actually engaging in a sexual act with the person that's actually being displayed. Well, I think that if we look at what is the need to eat about, right? The body uses energy. The body needs to replenish its energy, and the food is the way that we get that. The body needs water, and we get the water through having a drive to get it. The question about, what is the real need behind sexuality? Is it to reproduce, or is it to get pleasure? If you believe that it's to reproduce, then, well, I mean, certainly you do have a reproductive component to it, but it's not, I would say, the primary reason that we have sexuality, the humans have sexuality. Is it to get pleasure? Well, there are lots of other ways that we can get pleasure other than sexual arousal. The book, I think, I lay out the belief that sexuality is really about intimacy. It's about knowing someone else and being known, and that includes your body as well. And there's a unique kind of sexual intimacy, which I actually will refer to more as genital intimacy, where you are able to become one in a genital way. That is what really is a powerful thing and taps into this circuit, which is the same circuit that drugs tap into. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the normal course of human sexual interaction, there is a context to it. And that context is a story. And men and women pick up on different cues that are part of that story, and they're drawn to each other, and they are sexually intimate with each other, and that produces a whole set of neurological events. And the point of those neurological events, I believe, is to bind them to each other, and to bind them to each other as a part of that process of bringing them closer to each other and showing God's exclusive love for His people in that way.
Here we go. Scratching the Surface documentary, Dr. William Struthers, scene 1, take 3. Mark? So for the guy who is allowing himself to be continuously exposed, what would you say?
Well, what I would say is that it does have consequences. And if you look at we'll say kind of the textbook picture of what's going on, when a man looks at pornography, it's going to trigger a whole host of bodily reactions. It's going to cause him to produce, the hormones that cause him to become aroused sexually. It's going to cause the hormones that cause his body to become aroused. Would
that be the same for female as well?
It's a little different with women. Women's sexual arousal is not like that's shocking that men and women are aroused differently, yeah. But the hormones are utilized differently. For men, it's testosterone. We know that testosterone gets men ramped up and prepared to engage in a sexual act. But when a man is just sort of wandering in the world, he doesn't have these huge surges of testosterone that make him go looking for someone to have sex with. But when he sees a sexual image, there is a reflexive release of these hormones that causes him to get ramped up, and he knows this, and he begins to feel sexually aroused, and that sexual arousal has consequences. It has to be resolved at some point. And so when a man looks at pornography, what he's doing is he's taking in more and more of these signals that are ramping him up more and more, and he needs to have that release. And for many guys, what happens is they get to a place where they're so aroused that the logical thing to do is to masturbate. And so what they do is they masturbate, but the male orgasm has neurological consequences to it. The male brain is lit up and is activated when a man ejaculates in many ways the same way that it is when he takes heroin or when he takes cocaine. And you get the same kind of charge out of this ejaculation that you were to get if you were to take a hit of crack or something like that.
What are the long-term effects of exposing yourself to pornography?
Well, the long-term effects are what that natural release is for. The natural point of the ejaculation, I would say, is to say, this is important, I need to remember this. I need to come back to this place and do this again. And with drugs, it kind of, jumps in and short circuits that system. But when you do it naturally with pornography, what happens is it's not the relationship with the woman that you're with that says, oh, I need to do this again. It's, oh, I saw this porn and I got ramped up and I masturbated. I have to do this again. And so that's how they get into this cycle and this habit.
So what I gather from this is there's some level of escalation that's happening. Could you explain a bit, why does that happen?
Well, let's start with the chemical drugs first. It happens with a chemical drug because the chemical drug, for the most part, isn't natural. I mean, it's something that is consumed and the body doesn't expect that. So what happens is you get this huge release of these neurotransmitters and these hormones, and the brain says, well, I can't handle this. So what we're going to do is we're going to dampen down our ability to enjoy this stuff. And so the effect then is that you don't enjoy food as much, you don't enjoy water as much, and you wouldn't enjoy sex as much if you're taking drugs. And many drug addicts just don't eat and they don't drink, they just go after the drug. And it's because the brain sort of prevents itself from getting that high again. And so they go to try to get the same high, but the brain won't let it. And so they have to take more and more and more to try to get the same response, and the brain becomes less and less responsive to it. So if you think that that's what's going on with drugs, let's move that over and think about what's going on with sex, right? Well, for the most part, sex is a natural thing, right? It's something that we should be expecting to be normally wired into the brain, and it is. But it becomes problematic when you've got an artificial way of inducing this arousal. You know, the type of pornography that's available now was never available in human history. I mean, you had maybe dirty drawings on a cave or something like that, but that didn't really elicit the same kind of charge. If you can get on a 50-inch HD television, a picture of a woman engaging in a sexual act, brain's not wired to expect that kind of thing, because there aren't women who have 50-inch HD TV bodies out there. They're normal. The brain's expecting a normal interaction. So when you start now giving it this artificial kind of digital drug that it's taking in, the brain doesn't know what to do with it. So it does very much the same thing that it would do with a natural drug, which is to make it kind of less responsive. And so when you engage in the act and you get the charge out of it and you masturbate to it and you try to elicit that same sort of euphoria that you would get, well, the brain kind of starts to respond to that and make that less easy to get. The only way to do it is to ramp up the dose, to ramp up the stimuli, to try to get the same original charge.
So what's the effect of continuously being bombarded with visually stimulating images?
The effect is that the brain is going to adapt to it because that's what it does. And so over time, you will just be desensitized to it and you'll need more the next time around in order to get aroused.
So that explains why someone might start at a specific type of pornography but then end up with another one?
Yeah, for a lot of guys, there's that first kind of exposure and that first time that they get the drug, the digital drug of pornography, and they're constantly chasing after that. But their brain is preventing them from ever getting that again. And so behaviorally, they try to compensate by just ramping it up and making it more and more, graphic pornography, or they just do it more and more frequently to try to keep going after it like a rat pressing a bar to get water. Wow. I think that what we really need to be moving towards is looking at what are the reasons why men are looking at pornography. I think many times they're looking at it because they're depressed or they might have self-esteem issues. There are some men who certainly look at it because it produces that euphoria. What I would say is guaranteed is that as you look at that sexual stimuli, you're going to become aroused and you're going to need to deal with that arousal. And you're going to need to find ways that effectively handle that arousal. For some men, this will progress into very, very, bad, unhealthy types of behavior. For other men, it might kind of get hijacked in a different direction for a different kind of thing. So I wouldn't want to say that you're guaranteed to be progressing and get more and more pornography, but what you might find is that many men will use it to, actually I'll say will misuse it to deal with problems that the pornography really doesn't help them with.
Mm-hmm. Take 4, Mark. Is there any difference between pornography and chemical stimulants?
Well, what's different about pornography when compared to drugs is many times drugs are kind of pills that you'll take, and they're very artificial. So they're artificial ways of stimulating the natural system that the body's expecting to be excited by. Pornography is much more insidious because even though it's not real, it's digital, it mimics the natural system, the natural image of a woman that you would expect to see much more readily than the drug does. So it takes advantage of what the brain is really naturally expecting, but it's not natural. It's different, but it looks a little more natural than, say, like a drug would be, which is why it's much more insidious.
So it means that that highway is already paved?
Yeah, the highway's paid for it and it's waiting for the signals to come. And this is not like a big semi that's rumbling down, a 1-lane highway. This is, a set of cars that are going down, a 4-lane highway. They're exactly what this thing is built for, but they're not real cars. They're something else. And so if you take a guy who, let's say we'll take a single guy who doesn't, have an outlet for his sexuality, and he goes and he looks at these images and he's viewing them